A new study indicates that playing violent video games or watching violent movies doesn't necessarily make you a violent person.
Anna, I have a lot of preconceived notions from the 80s, and these last two stories are fucking those up. So I would like you to throw them out of the show. Smoking weed leads directly to using heroin and fucks with your brain forever. Right. And if you play violent video games, you will kill your best friend. That's what I was taught when I was 17. I would like that to still be true.
Now, the interesting thing is, now that we have studies proving that that's not necessarily the case with marijuana or violent video games, there is still a lot of debate within the scientific community as to whether or not video games or violent movies actually make a person violent. However, this recent study actually kind of discredits all the other studies out there that have made the argument that there is a correlation between violent video games and violent behavior. So let me tell you who the researchers are and exactly what they did. Christopher Ferguson, a psychologist at Stetson University in Florida, carried out 2 studies into media violence. In the first, his team correlated U.S. homicide rates between 1920 and 2005 with instances of violence depicted in motion pictures. Although there was evidence of a moderate correlation between a rise in screened and real-life violence during the 1950s, this reversed throughout the rest of the century, with instances of screen violence inversely related to homicide rates in the 1990s. So all he's doing here is he's looking at a correlation. And so he's making the argument that, hey, look at this. We have the violent video games, we have the violent movies. You don't see an increase in crime. You don't see that people become more violent. There's no correlation there. There's a slight correlation maybe in the 1950s, but for the rest of the time that we're looking at, you don't see that correlation. So all these other studies that make the argument don't really make sense. All you have to do is look at the data. Now, there's more that I want to read to you guys. In the second study, consumption of violent video games was measured against youth violence rates in the previous 20 years. The study concluded that playing video games coincided with a fall in violent crime perpetrated by those in the 12 to 17 age group. Now look, studies like this are really important, and the reason why I say that is because whenever we have a mass shooting, whenever something violent happens in the country, there is a certain group of people that want to ignore real threats in the country, like, I don't know, the deregulated gun industry or our lack of mental health care in the country, and instead they look at video games and movies as a scapegoat. And let's stop wasting our time, okay? If you are predisposed to being a violent person, sure, maybe video games and violent imagery will somehow trigger your violent behavior. But in this case, if you're a normal human being and you're playing violent video games, you're not going to all of a sudden go outside and shout people.
It seems obvious. It's crazy. Yes, stop saying that when we're having the gun debate, don't blame it on Hollywood. I mean, there's a very convenient move by the NRA, by gun makers, by the gun lobby, that just and that literally it somehow worked its way into a legitimate form of conversation.
Yes.
In part because there was nothing to set it, there was nothing to contradict it, because that passed the eye test, or the smell test, where you'd think, well, that makes sense.
It seems logical.
But what was also true is that we weren't becoming really more violent as a country. We'd always been violent, right? And the crime rates, there were some skyrocketing crime rates in the 70s, but it evened out. And the crime rates have a lot more to do with the economy, and a lot more to do with just literally the number of people of crime age out there. And when there are a lot of them, they commit more crimes. And when there are less of them, as the population ebbs and flows, there's fewer crimes. And that seems more definitive than anything. What this doesn't do is what I would say, and I have no research on this whatsoever, but I think that we don't need, when we look at violence in the movies or on television and on video games, which I definitely feel is almost a bigger deal because you're involved in it, what does that do to kids in general? They don't make them more violent. Nobody's going to go out and beat somebody with a rock. We've established this. It doesn't happen. Does it do something else to them? Does it make us as a country more inured to the power of violence? Do we expect it more? Are we less stunned when there's a school shooting? I think the answer to that is yes. I don't know, but I think the answer is yes. That as movies have gotten more violent, as video games have gotten more violent, is there another, are we taking that blow somewhere else? This is the wrong question to ask, or at least it was an okay question to ask that now we have an answer to. But I still don't like it, and I don't think it's good, and I don't want my kid playing violent video games, and I wish kids would play fewer violent video games. And I want them to know instinctively, and I want someone to prove it to me before I'm going to change my mind, and I'm prepared to have them prove it to me, that when you see violent death after violent death and brutal acts committed against women and everybody else in movie after movie after movie, and in video game after video game that you're involved in, where you get to kill somebody and you see the pain and you see the blood. I want my daughter to know, and I want her friends to know, when somebody gets shot, it is fucking awful and horrible and painful, and they panic and they want their mothers, and then they slowly die, and then they have a realization that they're going to die, and they panic, and their friends cry for months. Like, we don't get that in video games, and we don't get that in movies, and
But I think you get that in real life.
I hope so.
Yeah.
I don't want. I think the risk is that we are getting somewhat anesthetized to that. That we live in a world where, God forbid, you can't show a man's penis on TV, but you can show a guy getting his fingers cut off and then his throat slit, and then he bleeds to death on the ground.
Yeah, I feel
Fine,
like you
pass.
should be able to show both. Depending on what the network is and what the show is and what the time of the day is. But
What time is it okay for penises?
Yeah, I mean, like, if it's late at night, you want to see a penis, you should be able to see a penis. But look, the argument that I would make to that, and I do have a little bit of data, although I don't have specific numbers, I do know for a fact that violent crime in the United States has gone down in the last few decades. So. And at the same time, video games have become more readily available. You know, of course, with the internet, they've become much more visual and much more, maybe visual is not the right word, but much more realistic, you know, with their imagery and everything. So, I mean, that's not a scientific study right there, but if you're going to make an argument about video games leading to a more violent society, then violent crime rates have actually gone down.
I'm with you. I don't think it has. I think
Yeah.
it has led to a society where we care less about violence, where we're moved less by it. I want my daughter and her friends to grow up in a world where violence strikes them as a hideous, awful thing that when they see it, it turns their stomach.
Yep.
And I think that we have lost that already for generations and generations because of the violence we show. And I love these shows. Me too. But I want them, and hopefully, and maybe I'm wrong, and maybe they still have the exact same violence to actually seeing it, or if they see it not just on the street in front of them, but if they see it on the news. I just don't want people to shrug their shoulders at this. And I think that that's a whole other area of study which I'd be interested in. But as for it affecting crime rates and making us a more violent country, it appears that it just doesn't.
Yeah.
You're right.